and welcome to lecture 12.4. So today we're going to look at attitudes, and we're also going to look at issues of stereotyping, modern racism, and some other stuff. So we're going to focus on how attitudes are formed. We're going to look at characteristics of attitudes that are predictive of behavior. We'll look at explicit and implicit attitudes. We'll describe cognitive dissonance theory. We're going to look at persuasion and pervasiveness of messages and the elaboration likelihood model. So in our last lecture, we talked about how attitudes are formed and how they can be predictive of behavior. So now let's look at the difference between explicit attitudes and implicit attitudes. An explicit attitude is an attitude that you're able to report. So if I ask you your opinion about how coronavirus is being handled in Oregon, you're able to tell me what you think and feel about that. Implicit attitudes are attitudes that influence our feelings and behavior at an unconscious level. They're attitudes that we don't know we have. Now, sometimes our implicit attitudes are contradictory to our explicit attitudes. And when we look at stereotyping, prejudice, and racism, I think we'll be able to see that in more detail. So implicit attitudes are not ones that you're able to articulate. And yet those are the attitudes that shape how you feel and how you behave. So got some really good videos for this chapter and this lecture. The first one I'd like you to watch is titled, "This Test Reveals Implicit Biases You Don't Know You Have." You'll find that in the folder titled Chapter 12, Social Psychology Lecture Videos. So please go take a look at that right now. You can also take Harvard's implicit bias test. You can find a link to that in the Chapter 12 Social Psychology Resources folder. And if you pull up the student version of this PowerPoint, you can actually just click this link. And then also, please watch Implicit Bias, How It Affects Us and How We Push Through It. This video is brilliant. It made me think quite a bit about the power of implicit bias and the work that's necessary to try to overcome implicit bias. Because we're not able to articulate most of our, or any of our implicit biases, it is difficult to try to counter or reshape these biases, but it can be done. It takes time, it takes a willingness and even the desire to work on this issue. But implicit bias is pretty powerful, and I think you'll really enjoy this TED Talk. As we have been, in the last couple years, there's been a lot of very tragic stories of black men being shot by white police officers, and they're shot in situations that white men aren't shot in. And I was talking with a friend of mine who's a police officer. He's not a street officer, but he said, we really do a lot of training about implicit bias, trying to address issues, those unconscious assumptions and beliefs that we have. But when we see the news, it's really hard to see that training is being used. I think one of the best ways to fight bias is education. Right now, with Coronapocalypse, John and I have been talking about how sad it is that our society's understanding of basic science is so poor. It's leading to a lot of misinformation. People are falling for scams. And I just find that very sad. this implicit biases aren't just about race or sex. They're about all kinds of things. We just have biases against certain things, and we are very vulnerable to persuasion because implicit bias happens on an unconscious level. We are easily manipulated when it comes to the creation of biases. Now, cognitive dissonance is a really fascinating phenomenon. This is an uncomfortable mental state resulting from a contradiction between two attitudes or between an attitude and behavior. I'm going to go to my next slide and come back. My desire to be well-informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. This is me right now. I have actually decided, I've made a conscious decision to not check the news every 30 minutes because my desire to remain sane requires that I not pay attention 24/7. The news is just so overwhelming, and I'm not being uninformed, but I have made a decision that sometimes, a decision that's uncomfortable for me sometimes, but I've had to unplug a little bit to help with that uncomfortable mental state. I can't be fully plugged in 24/7 and stay sane right now. I just can't do it, so I had to make a choice. A good example, people experience cognitive dissonance when they smoke, even though they know smoking might kill them. So I'm the only non-smoker in my family. And my mom has emphysema and she's still smoking. My dad has one kidney. He's had several cancers. He's still smoking. My entire life, they've always wanted to quit. They know that this is bad for them. They know that it's very bad for them. But cognitive dissonance leaves all of us with this sense that we are going to be the exception to the rule. It's more difficult to think about quitting smoking than thinking about, I could die in the future because of smoking. One is very immediate. The idea of quitting smoking seems very immediate. We all think of death as far away. Now, people can reduce dissonance by changing their attitudes or behaviors, or they rationalize or trivialize the discrepancies. I think a good example of this would be in teens that are in conservative religious families. They've found that while age of first intercourse is higher for these teens, they're also finding cases, they're finding that this population of teens is showing more infections of gonorrhea in the eyes and the mouth, because sex is defined as intercourse for this population. As long as they're not inserting a penis in a vagina, they're still virgins. And yet they are engaging in sexual behavior. This is a sense of cognitive dissonance, rationalizing the discrepancy between, we shouldn't ever have sex until we're married, and, well, as long as I only do this much, it's okay. If your numbers are correct, my strategic plan is irrational. Spoink. Cognitive dissonance takes over. You sure are bad with numbers. We've all had these moments, and we've certainly all watched this happen in others. And we just shake our head, and we roll our eyes, and then we just keep going. One way to get people to change their attitudes is to change their behaviors first. And here's something that's key. You need to use as few incentives as possible. Now, this seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't it be more helpful to change behavior with lots of incentives? Well, changing behavior with incentives can be very effective, But in order to change attitudes, you have to use as few incentives as possible. I'm going to come back to that. No, sorry. In one original dissonance study, participants performed an extremely boring task and then reported to other participants how enjoyable it was. Some participants were paid $20 to lie to the participants that hadn't done the study yet, while some were paid less than $1 to lie. And what they found was that those participants who were paid more to lie about their experience reported enjoying it less than those who were paid less to lie. So, if you look at this figure in your textbook, those participants who were paid only $1 experienced a lot of cognitive dissonance. So they had to find a way to justify saying that they enjoyed the task. One of the ways of doing that is changing their feelings about the actual task, but not knowing that. Give me a moment. Here's a good example. Another Dilbert cartoon. So why should I hire you as my consultant? I'll use my special process of cognitive dissonance to improve employee morale. How does it work? When people are in an absurd situation, their minds rationalize it by inventing a comfortable illusion. Dogbert goes up to a worker. Isn't it strange that you have this dead-end job when you're twice as smart as your boss? The hours are long, the pay is mediocre, nobody respects your contributions, and yet you freely choose to work here. It's absurd. No. Wait, there must be a reason. I must work here because I love the work. I love this job. That's one of the ways we cope with cognitive dissonance. We can change our attitudes using as few incentives as possible. So the less you are, the fewer incentives you use, the more effective you can be with changing attitudes. That's completely counterintuitive, but that's how it works, because the person has to justify why they're doing something they probably dislike for so little. So dissonance arises when a person holds positive attitudes about different options, but must choose one of the options. So for example, a person might have trouble deciding which college to attend. They narrow down their choices to 2 or 3 alternatives, and then they need to choose. This is a big decision. I really struggled with this decision when I was looking at graduate schools. What happens is once we've made our decision, post-decisional dissonance motivates that person to focus on one school's, the chosen school's positive aspects, and the other school's negative aspects. It's a way of soothing yourself that you made the right decision. Now, we don't realize that we're doing this. This just happens organically. But whenever we make a decision and then move on through that decision, there's always the what if. With post-decisional dissonance, this is our brain's way of self-soothing. You chose this school, and you think of all of the positive aspects, and you must have not chosen to go to these other schools because of all these negative aspects. So this occurs automatically with minimal cognitive processing and without awareness. This is a good look at how the unconscious mind can juggle a tremendous amount of information. We have implicit biases and attitudes that we're not aware of, and yet still shape our behavior. And our brain learns how to cope with cognitive dissonance and post-decisional dissonance without our awareness. Now, we can become aware of these, but it takes a lot of effort on our part. When people put themselves through pain, embarrassment, or discomfort to join a group, they experience a great deal of dissonance. To resolve the dissonance, they inflate the importance of that group and their commitment to it. This justification of effort helps explain why people are willing to subject themselves to humiliating experiences such as hazing. Whenever we undergo an unpleasant social situation, one of the ways we cope with that emotionally is to inflate how important it was to us. Or we just break down and cry. But when justifying putting in a lot of effort into something, we have to inflate how important that task was in order to justify why we worked so hard, why we risked embarrassment, felt uncomfortable, or even felt physical pain. In order to cope with the difficulty, discomfort, embarrassment, and pain, we inflate the importance of that group or task. Because why else would we have gone through the embarrassment, discomfort, and pain? This justification of effort helps explain why people are willing to subject themselves to humiliating experiences. And then we get to persuasion. This is the act and conscious effort to change an attitude through the transmission of a message. We are extremely vulnerable to the power of persuasion. Often we don't realize how vulnerable we are to persuasion. So there's some factors that affect how persuasive a message is. The source, the content, and the receiver. So who is doing the persuading? What is the content that they're persuading about? And to whom are they trying to persuade? I don't know if any of you have seen the show Mad Men. It's about an advertising corporation in New York in the 60s. It does a great job looking at issues of persuasion. So there's what's called the elaboration likelihood model. The idea that persuasive messages lead to attitude changes in two ways, the central route or the peripheral route. The central route uses rational cognitive processes. And this can create strong attitudes that last over time and that people will actively defend. So once they're persuaded using a central route, they grab onto these attitudes, hold them strongly, and pass on these attitudes to others. The peripheral route requires very little processing. And so people tend to be more impulsive using these attitudes. So let's use the 2016 election as an example. All American intelligence agencies, 17 of them, have agreed that yes, Russia did influence our 2016 election. And Russia primarily used the peripheral route. They did this through manipulating political messages. they would increase certain types of messages in certain locations, like Twitter and Facebook. But they did so in a way that people didn't really realize they were being influenced, that they were being persuaded to have certain attitudes. Had they gone with the central route, people would have noticed that there was that there were odd groups trying to persuade us to believe something specific, whether it be about Trump or Clinton. For the Russian interference in the election, the peripheral route of persuasion was much more effective because people don't think through the information they've received. It's not laziness. It's just that the mind doesn't realize that, oh, maybe I should, kind of think through that, the commercial I just saw, or we have to make an effort, a strong effort to analyze the information that we receive. And a lot of us don't like to take the time to do that. One of the things that's rough is, we all have our biases. So if someone's trying to persuade us using a peripheral route, we're not likely to see that they're trying to persuade us. And our existing biases make us even more vulnerable to persuasion if our bias somewhat agrees with the with the persuasion that's we're undergoing. So I'm going to let you take a look at this in your textbook. This looks at peripheral processing and central processing. So now we're going to look at how people think about others. We'll look at the role of appearance and nonverbal behavior. We'll look at the fundamental attribution error and the actor-observer discrepancy. We'll look at stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination. We'll define modern racism and how it impacts prejudice and discrimination. And we'll look at strategies to inhibit stereotypes and reduce prejudice. The first thing that we notice about other people is their face. The face communicates a lot of what we need to know in the moment. It helps us interpret the person's emotional state, how interested they are in the interaction. We assess how competent they are and how trustworthy they are based on facial expressions. There's a really interesting phenomenon that happens where the more attractive someone is, the more other people rate them as friendly, smart, trustworthy. How physically attractive our cultures would rate somebody as has a lot to do with how we interpret them as far as their intelligence, their trustworthiness, their competency, their likability. According to popular perception, trustworthy people can look us in the eye. No. While eye contact is important in social situations, how people perceive eye contact depends on culture. In Western culture, we expect people to look us in the eye. We get uncomfortable when people don't look us in the eye. In Asian cultures, the opposite is true. Looking at someone in the eye can be rude. And so, in typical social gatherings, you don't look other people in the eye. And that's something that I've noticed as I've taught over the years, that Asian students tend to not look me in the eye. And it took me for a little while to put all of this together, that this was culture. And so now I try to be more careful about my use of eye contact for those who are not Westerners. So when it comes to social psychology, nonverbal behavior matters tremendously. We interpret facial expressions, gestures, mannerisms, and movements as we communicate with each other. We rely on a lot on our interpretation of other people's body language. There are lots of blogs out there, lots of articles. Well, if the person crosses their arms, it means X, Y, and Z. Well, often it just means my back hurts when I cross my arms. I'm not trying to distance myself from other people. I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to show as being uninterested or uncaring or scared. My back just hurts, and it feels better when I cross my arms in front of me. We tend to put a lot into this idea that we can interpret other people's body language, and that certain gestures can be interpreted as meaning X, Y, and Z. Human behavior is much more complicated than that. Now, there is such thing as body language. We certainly do use other people's facial expressions, their gestures, mannerisms, and movements. We use those to interpret what they're thinking and feeling all the time. But we need to be careful when we come across these websites that, say, well, this person was doing this at minute 3 and 27 seconds, and that means X, Y, and Z. Most of that is just bullshit. There's what are called thin slices of behavior. These are seconds-long. A thin slice of behavior is a seconds-long observation that offers powerful cues for impression formation. We do read a lot. We spend a lot of time and energy reading other people's body language. During the first, especially the first 9 months of life, infants are fascinated with faces. They spend a lot of time analyzing faces. And in infants, you can watch them as they're looking at someone's face, and you can see that they're really thinking hard. Facial expressions are universal. Infants spend a tremendous amount of time analyzing faces because they're learning about being social creatures. They're learning, how can I interpret someone else's mood? What should a face look like when someone's angry versus happy? Nonverbal behavior also gives us what's called theory of mind. So theory of mind means that you have a theory about what someone else thinks and feels. Whenever we're interacting with people, we operate on theory of mind, what we suspect the person is feeling and thinking. And that's a good thing. We have to operate with some kind of framework. Theory of mind is a really brilliant concept. It starts at birth. At birth, we're starting to just put the most basic parts together, like facial expressions. But even, through our elder years, we rely on theory of mind to operate socially. We use these thin slices of behaviors to help form our impression of others' theory of mind. So, as I mentioned, there's a lot of blogs that will tell you X, Y, and Z about body language. There is a really good blog called Eyes for Lies. You've got the link right here, and it's linked to on Moodle as well in the Chapter 12 Social Psychology Resources folder. And there's a group that are labeled Truth Wizards. And most people are really awful at reading body language. We're all pretty bad at detecting deception. But there's this teeny tiny little population called Truth Wizards. Paul Eichmann and his colleagues have done a lot of research on this and found that this population can detect deception with a 90% or higher accuracy. Now, a lie detector test is at best 70% reliable. It's a pseudoscience. Lie detector tests are crap. Truth wizards have an amazing ability to know when someone is lying. So the woman that runs this blog is brilliant. She's been researched and has tested as a truth wizard. And it's really interesting to watch her break down videos of interviews. Truth wizards are able to read what are called micro expressions much more effectively than the rest of us. So we all, we're all familiar with the basic 5 or 6 facial expressions, anger, surprise, joy, happiness, fear. We can all identify those facial responses. Micro expressions are where the truth lie. And for truth wizards, they're able to see micro expressions in a way that the rest of us don't. And this is innate for them. They didn't train themselves to do this. They can just do it. I recommend checking out her blog. It's pretty interesting. So let's look at attributions. An attribution is a person's explanation for why events or actions occur. And we make attributions about others. That's part of theory of mind. We are motivated to draw inference in part by a basic need for order and predictability. Forming attributions to understand others is a necessary thing. When we look at social psychology, a lot of it seems like we're trying to look at the dark side of humanity. Please keep in mind that we're also looking at the brilliant part of humanity too. Yes, our attributions can lead to huge social errors, but we also need the process of creating attributions, because we would be overwhelmed in our social relationships if we were trying to analyze on a more complex level other people's thoughts and feelings. We just don't have that time. In order to interact with, we're a highly social species. In order to interact together, we have to have these shortcuts, and creating attributions is one of the ways we do that. So we are motivated to draw inferences because of basic need for order and predictability. Heider distinguished between 2 types of attributions. The first is personal attributions, in which people's behavior is explained based on internal characteristics, such as personality, or intelligence, or abilities, musical abilities, sports, various type artistic abilities, based on traits, moods, or efforts. These are attributions that are made based on who the person is. Situational attributions are explanations of people's behavior that refer to external events, such as weather, luck, accidents, or other people's actions. Situational attributions are about the external around the person. So personal attributions are about the person themselves. Situational attributions are about the situations surrounding the person. Viner noted that attributions can vary on other dimensions. So attributions can be stable over time, or they're permanent, or unstable, temporary. So an example of an unstable attribution would be, let's say, the weather. So so-and-so fell off their bicycle because the roads were wet and they slipped. But usually they're a really good bicyclist. That would be a temporary, because the weather is temporary. Stable attribution would be something about let's say so-and-so has been a bicyclist for 30 years and is usually a really good bicyclist. So permanent versus temporary, and controllable or uncontrollable. The weather's uncontrollable. There's not much that person can do because the weather made the roads wet. Now we come to correspondence bias. And this is where the emphasis, the expectancy that people's actions correspond with their beliefs and their personalities. So we just assume that people behave in accordance with their belief system and their personalities. Now, each one of us has had a time where we have behaved in a way that is counter to what we believe or counter to who we perceive ourselves to be. But when we're reading other people, we make the assumption that people are always acting in agreement with their beliefs and their personalities. This leads us to two types of errors. There's the fundamental attribution error and the actor-observer discrepancy. The fundamental attribution error maintains that that in explaining other people's behavior, there's a tendency to overemphasize personality traits and underestimate situational factors. With the fundamental attribution error, we are making an attribution based on that person's core self, and we overlook situational factors that may have limited that person's ability to act on their actual beliefs and personalities. The actor-observer discrepancy. When interpreting our own behavior, we tend to focus on situations. When interpreting other people's behavior, we tend to focus on dispositions, on who they are. So when something goes wrong in our own lives, we blame the situation. Of course we blame the situation. It is much more psychologically comfortable to blame a situation rather than a key component of our actual self. When we are interpreting other people's behaviors, we are assuming they are acting on their true disposition, that their actions are a true reflection of who they are. And we tend to overlook the situation when making attributions about their own behavior. So with the actor-observer discrepancy, let's say two students fail the exam. And one of the students who failed the exam says, well, I couldn't study very much because my roommates are really noisy and they wouldn't be quiet. But that other person failed because they're just not very smart. Might the person's roommates be noisy? Yeah, but maybe they waited till the very last second to study. Actor-observer discrepancy allows us to be comfortable with ourselves. This brings us to stereotypes. A stereotype is defined as a cognitive schema that helps us organize information about people based on their membership in certain groups. You're asking yourself, okay, what's a schema? We have to categorize our world 24/7. And we begin doing this at birth. We start building file cabinets. And in our file cabinets, we have files that are called schemas. And so we use schemas to organize information. And we just do this automatically. So you might have a schema for animals. And in that file, that includes every kind of species, earthworms and elephants and whales. But then you can kind of fine-tune your schemas as well into mammals and non-mammals. A schema just lets us categorize and organize our world. And we rely on these schemas quite a bit because they're shortcuts, and they're necessary shortcuts. So when it comes to stereotyping, these schemas allow for easy, fast processing of social information. With stereotypes, they occur automatically, largely outside of our awareness. They streamline the formation of impressions about others. And stereotypes allow us to deal with the limitations inherent in mental processing. There are limits to how much we can process at one time. And so the brain has done this amazing thing by figuring out schemas, fast ways to organize information. Let me just check something. Okay. So there are what are called illusory correlations. I love these. So an illusory correlation is when you see a relationship between two things that doesn't exist. So a really excellent and I think timely example of this is the vaccines cause autism, illusory correlation. There's absolutely positively no science showing that autism can evolve because of vaccines. There's no evidence. But what happens is the symptoms of autism start arising at the time where infants are being vaccinated a lot. So people see a relationship and then just make a link. Now, this is actually pretty brilliant. I mean, it is a great mental shortcut, but illusory correlations can be dangerous too. We have to see that we are making illusory correlations sometimes, and we have to analyze the evidence. What is the evidence on vaccines and autism? The evidence shows that there is absolutely no relationship between vaccines and autism. None. And yet, some people see this illusion of a relationship. There's also subtyping. And that's when we encounter someone who does not fit a stereotype. So we put that person in a special category rather than alter the stereotype. So let's use the example of transgendered individuals. We try to when we're using our schemas for sex and gender, we typically start out with two, men and women. Now we have people who have more opportunities, if they're transgendered, to live as a transgendered person. But we still don't know very many. Each of us is unlikely to know very many transgendered people. So rather than alter our stereotypes for what a woman is and what a man is, we'll create a special category for that one individual transgendered person. Stereotypes can be positive, neutral, or negative. Often when we hear the word stereotype, we automatically assume it's a bad thing. And that's not true. But negative stereotypes can lead to dangerous things. So there's what's called prejudice. And these are negative feelings, opinions, and beliefs associated with a stereotype. And discrimination, the inappropriate and unjustified treatment of people as a result of prejudice. Prejudice is a feeling, it's a belief, but discrimination is the action based on that prejudice. So why do stereotypes lead to prejudice and discrimination? People treat others as scapegoats to relieve stress. This is absolutely true. I certainly do this, and because I'm human, we all do this. One of the ways to feel better about ourselves is to create scapegoats when things are going wrong. So it's not my fault that something went wrong. It's because of this group of people. People discriminate against others to protect their own self-esteem. Stereotyping is a way to protect our sense of self. And we favor our own group and stigmatize those who pose threats to our groups. So, as we talked about earlier in this chapter, we spend a lot of time protecting our own groups. And one of the ways we protect our own group is by forming stereotypes about other groups. And often those stereotypes of other groups are somewhat negative. How negative they are depends on the group being stereotyped. So here's a really interesting study. The hypothesis of the study is that stereotypes can influence basic perceptual processes. So this used all white subjects, and each subject was shown a picture of a white face or a black face. Immediately upon viewing a picture of a face, participants were shown a picture of an object and asked to classify that object as a gun or as a tool as quickly as possible. The results: subjects primed by seeing black faces identified the object as a gun more quickly and mistook tools for guns. What this means is, so if you're the subject, and if you're a white subject and you're shown a white face, and then I pull the face away and I quickly show you a picture of a wrench and pull it away and ask you, was that a tool or a weapon? If you saw the white face, you're more likely to recognize it as a tool. If you're a white subject who saw the black face first, and then was asked to categorize the object that you see, you are more likely to misidentify the object as being a weapon. Now, this study wasn't done, people didn't have time to think through. This was, okay, here's your answer. You give your answer in 1 second. Boom, boom. And that gives us some insight into how people correlate how they make relationships between stereotypes and events. Stereotypes can influence basic perceptual processes. What you see in your world is not reality. The issue is, how has your reality been shaped by stereotypes? So we know that there's evidence that suggests special computerized training in which race is unrelated to the presence of a weapon can help police officers avoid racial bias in deciding when to shoot someone. When police officers, there's been a couple cases like this in the last year where a white police officer has shot a black man and said, I thought they had a gun in their hand. With one guy, it was a cell phone. A cell phone looks nothing like a gun. But what happened? That white officer saw a black face, and the stereotypes that our culture has perpetuated, not just this one officer, but this is a common stereotype amongst Americans. The stereotype actually influenced what the white officer thought he saw. Well, there was something in his hand. It must have been a gun. I've seen videos of white officers who have shot a black man saying, he had a weapon on him. They searched the body and there's nothing. There's nothing that had been in his hands, the victim's hands. The officer's stereotype created this twist of perception so that they imagined that the person was holding a weapon when the person was not holding a weapon at all. Most people know that expressing negative stereotypes publicly can lead to trouble. This can make researching stereotypes very difficult. We don't like to share some of our dark thoughts, and while stereotyping is cognitively necessary, it's a shortcut, and we do categorize people based on multitudes of characteristics, not just race. We all stereotype. It is a normal, natural cognitive process, and we're not even aware that we're doing it because it's a shortcut but it's a necessary shortcut. We're such a social species, and we are a very populous species. Stereotyping is necessary. It's what do we do with those stereotypes that matters? And it also, something that matters is, do we take the time to reflect upon our stereotypes? And do we take the time to make our categorization of others more accurate? Social norms have made it unacceptable for people to express prejudiced beliefs towards groups based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender. In the last 2 or 3 years, we have seen a large spike in white extremism. Something changed. We've gone from not being able to share, well, let me say it this way, those who are fairly prejudiced against minority populations feel more comfortable sharing their prejudice than they were 3 or 4 years ago. This has been a drastic change, and it is shaped by culture. The rules of stereotyping and prejudice have been changing these last 3 years, and it's odd. I remember when I was in college, I had gone to Boise, Idaho to visit some family, and we had gone to a movie. And I went into the restroom, and a woman came out of the stall wearing a Ku Klux Klan sweatshirt. Stopped me in my tracks, and I know my jaw was on the ground. And at first I couldn't put it all together. I had never seen someone be so blatant with their racism. I had never seen racism like that. Someone purposely advertising, proudly advertising on their clothing that they were racists. And then I realized white supremacists are everywhere. This person just doesn't worry about hiding it. The rules of sharing our stereotypes continue to change. And I think as we've looked at events in the last couple of years, we are seeing that extremists, there's all kinds of extremists, are feeling a little more comfortable sharing extremist stereotypes. So let's look at modern racism. Modern racism is subtle forms of prejudice that coexist with the rejection of racist beliefs. So, because people are reluctant to acknowledge explicit racist attitudes, researchers have created a questionnaire called the Modern Racism Scale. On Moodle, in the Chapter 12 Social Psychology Resources folder, you can find the Perceived Racism Scale, which is based on the theory of modern racism. And so we know that for many people, we like to think we're not racists. And most of us try really hard to not be racist. But we all go and we all stereotype. We all have prejudices. And with modern racism, you tend to overlook your prejudice because you're working so hard to not be prejudiced. Which raises the uncomfortable question. Can we truly be non-racist? And I don't have an answer for you. That is an answer that that's an issue you have to think about yourself, and I would encourage you to grapple with that question, because I think it's an important question. It's always been an important question. But can we truly be non-racist? I wasn't raised with racist ideology, but it was interesting. When I was in graduate school, I started dating a man from Uganda. I called my mom one afternoon and told her I was dating a new person, and she asked me about him. And I said, well, he's from Uganda. He's, such and such age, does this for Hewlett Packard, all that stuff. Her first question was, how black is he? I was stunned by that question. That the first question out of my mom's mouth was, how black is he? Because I wasn't raised to ask such questions. This was the woman that raised me to be as non-prejudicial as possible. But when it came to her daughter, her Norwegian daughter dating a black man, she couldn't keep in her stereotypes and her prejudices when it came so close to home for her. And that was a really surprising exchange with my mom. I don't believe my mom is racist against black people. I think we all have prejudices that we try to hide very, very much. And then sometimes they leak through like that. So an interesting discussion followed up with my mom about that. It still stuns me today that was her first question. So I encourage you to do the perceived racism scale. You will learn a lot about yourself. Now I would like you to watch the video titled, What It Takes to Be Racially Literate. Great video. Two young women on a TED Talk. It's not very long, but it's very thought-provoking, and it's a well-done presentation. So please take a minute to watch that. Welcome back. How can we reduce prejudice? One way is imagining positive social interactions with out-group members. Just having imaginary interactions with people who are not of your group can reduce prejudice and increase pro-social behaviors towards out-group members. Just the act of imagining a positive interaction increases the likelihood that your future interactions will be more positive. Prejudice can also be reduced through explicit efforts to train people about stereotypical associations. Just by opening your eyes to the stereotypes that you have, can you actually challenge your stereotypes? So when my mom asked me that question about Bill, how black is he? I was like, whoa, Mom, wait a minute, something's going on. That was a chance for her to open her eyes to some of her own prejudice. It forced her to take a look at some of her beliefs that she didn't know she had. And so in order to reduce prejudice, we have to recognize what we're prejudiced about, the types of stereotypes we have made about specific people and groups. Only through identification can we actually work on decreasing prejudice. To inhibit stereotypes, numerous studies have shown that yes, you can consciously alter your automatic stereotypes. It takes effort, and it takes a desire to make that effort, but it is possible. Inhibiting stereotyped thinking is difficult, and it requires self-control. It requires a lot of cognitive energy. It requires that you continue to analyze yourself, even if you find something uncomfortable about yourself. Now, this is a difficult thing because stereotyping is necessary. We have to stereotype. Our brain just does it because these cognitive shortcuts have helped us survive and reproduce. We can't judge every single individual as an individual. However, we need to take time to occasionally come to our stereotypes and look at, how have I categorized that person? What stereotype have I made and linked to that person? How accurate is that? It's only when we take that time and are willing to look at ourselves in a way that's uncomfortable can we actually inhibit or reduce our stereotypes. In one brain imaging study, the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain, became activated when white participants were briefly shown pictures of black faces. So in this study, a group of white college students were the subject group, and each subject would go into an fMRI machine and have their brain scans as they were showed pictures of unfamiliar black and white men. And then the researchers were looking at how did brain imaging change when the person saw a white face versus a black face. Now the subject, the white male college student, had never seen any of these faces before, so they were all unfamiliar faces. And what they found, so the amygdala is part of your fight, flight, or freeze system. The amygdala would light up when these white male college students saw unfamiliar black faces. Their fear system responded to unfamiliar black faces, but not unfamiliar white faces. That is how subtle stereotyping is. These people don't know that their amygdala, their fear system is activating when they saw an unfamiliar black face. None of us would know that, which is why we have to do brain imaging for it. It's just an automatic process. In order to work through our stereotypes, we have to really just sit down and take the time to do it. And over time, with practice, we'll become better at realizing, oh, I just stereotyped someone. And better at saying, hey, wait a minute, I should check on that. Did I really just make that assumption about that individual? Another way to decrease prejudice is perspective taking and perspective giving. With perspective taking, this is where people actively contemplate the psychological experiences of other people, where you take the time to think about what must that person think? What must they be feeling right now? Our brain is created to process this type of information very quickly without consciously analyzing that information. So it can be very useful to try to put yourself in someone else's shoes. That's perspective taking. Trying to understand, okay, when I went to college, I was on my own financially. I financed all of it. I did several work-study jobs. Yeah, it was really hard. And so I always kind of wondered, what is it like for my friends who who weren't in such poverty? There were times where I had to realize, in order to realize that they had a hard time too, I had to take time out and actually make a conscious effort to put myself in their shoes. Just because money wasn't a concern for them didn't mean that there weren't other aspects of their lives that weren't difficult. And then there's perspective giving, in which people share their experiences of being targets of discrimination. As a highly educated white woman in America, I sometimes wonder, do I have much perspective to give? The only thing that would put me any higher on the chain would be being male. Some of us have less experience being discriminated against. But it's still important that we give our experience, that we share our experience with those who are not like us. Now, critical roles in reducing prejudice are being heard from minority members and listening for majority group members. As someone that is high on the privilege chain, I need to listen. Because frankly, I have so much privilege that I have a lot to gain by listening and not much to gain by sharing. For those who are in minority groups, perspective giving is a gift that they are giving to the world. I can't even try to contemplate what it's like to be a poor Latino woman unless a woman who is in poverty that's Latino shares her stories with me. Perspective giving is critical, especially for those of minority groups, but we all have a perspective to share, and it's important that we do that. It's also important that we try to put ourselves in other people's shoes, that we try to take the perspective of someone else. So I feel like I went through some huge psychological issues in this lecture very quickly, and I do wish we had more time to elaborate on this. I've really been missing the discussions that we would have in class about these issues, because all of you have such interesting stories and experiences to share regarding prejudice, stereotyping, discrimination, racism, in groups and out groups. I'm really missing those discussions. So thanks for hanging in there, and I hope you're all doing well.